recap special. Tonight we will be going through all the main events that went on throughout the year.
We'll be discussing topics such as the presidential election of the year, communism, the Cold War, Korea, and sports news.
1948 was a big year with many different but important events occurring.
Today we will be starting with the presidential election of 1948, and here to give you some more information is Sarah Dunn.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I will be discussing the huge victory for Truman in the 1948 election and one of the biggest political upsets of the century. Truman started out as a vice president for only 4 months, and he wasn't nearly as popular as his opponent, Thomas Dewey, who was a well-known governor of New York. Not only was he running against Dewey, who was a part of the Republican Party, but he was also running against Henry Wallace, who was the candidate of the Progressive Party, and Strom Thurmond, who was a part of the States' Rights Party. In the spring of 1948, Truman was facing issues from both sides of the political spectrum because of his supports for civil rights, and on the other hand, because of his opinions on foreign policies. Nobody expected him to win against Dewey, but the results proved every political poll wrong.
And I want to thank this convention for its unanimous nomination of my good friend and colleague, Senator Barkley of Kentucky.
Not only were the political polls wrong, but even the newspaper, who was so confident that Dewey was going to win, printed the article out early. The most likely reason that Truman did win was probably because of his whistle stop, where he toured the nation and gave over 300 speeches in only a few amount of weeks. In these speeches, he attacked the Congress, calling them do-nothings, which was a big part of his campaign. Even after the election, Truman didn't stop working, and he used his executive power to pass a meaningful civil rights reform in the late 1950s, when he issued an executive order to desegregate the military. Although he has success later in his presidential career, earlier on he didn't have as much luck. Right at the beginning, he was facing 2 major issues, a labor movement and an aggressive Republican Party. When unionists demanded more pay and striked as a result of it, Truman passed an act that was ultimately vetoed by Congress called the Taft-Hartley Act, which was supposed to outlaw the closed stop. Truman was a man who really put himself out there to try to do the things that he believed would better the nation. Here's a past recap clip of an interview with President Truman that aired on ADS News back in the November of his historic presidential win.
Hello, Mr. President Harry Truman.
Hi, how are you today, Elizabeth?
I'm doing well, Mr. President. Thank you for asking. I'm here today to discuss the election and the steps you took to become the President of the United States. For example, what was it like running for president and knowing that most people weren't in your favor?
Well, it was a long journey to get here. I originally had very few supporters and struggled to gain popularity in the country. It was definitely a struggle knowing that I wasn't viewed in the way that I wanted to be, but it didn't stop me from persevering throughout my campaign. I ended up winning without getting the majority of the popular vote, which is partly what made this election so epic and memorable. Now that it's official that I'm President of the United States, I want to announce my proposal of creating a legislative program called the Fair Deal. This will help to improve the original New Deal and add new things like nationwide health insurance.
You are certainly one of a kind, Mr. Truman. That's a fantastic idea and will be viewed positively by the Democrats, Republicans, and everyone in between. Can you please tell me about your whistle stop campaign and how that affected your part in the election?
I toured the U.S. and gave over 300 speeches in just a couple of weeks. Throughout my speeches, I was really harsh about Congress. For example, I called them do-nothings. This is how I spread my personal political views and really helped improve my campaign.
It's incredible how you still won without the majority of the popular vote and how much you improved throughout the election. Here on ADS, we are excited for what's in store for you and your presidency, and we're always your #1 fan. Moving on to one of our bigger, if not biggest, issues going on in the world today, here's Abby Valone discussing if communism is coming to an end or if it's just getting started.
Hi, I'm Abby, and I'm here today to talk about the controversial idea of communism. In 1948, communism was still very strong in the Soviet ruling states, which were known as the satellite states. The U.S. was still very opposed to communism in general, as well as the spread of it, which is known as containment. The Cold War was in the process, and we showed our dedication by not letting anything get in our way of keeping the non-communist cities safe, by flying supplies into West Berlin when the Soviet Union tried to stop all highway, railway, and waterway traffic from entering. supplies were food, fuel, medical supplies, clothing, toys, and anything else that the residents needed. Similarly to the Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan also brought relief to Europe, helping out nations over in Western Europe with about 13 billion grants and loans with the reduction of famine, fuel for heated houses, and money for a start to economic growth. There's more to come about communism with Dan, who's coming to join me right after.
Thank you, Abby. To start off, I'd like to say that communism has been a recurring issue for about 30 years. The U.S. will not stop until we have put communism to an end, but I have a feeling that communism will be upon us for many years. On March 17th, President Truman spoke to a joint session of Congress and blamed the Soviet Union for the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia. President Truman also called on Congress to pass the Marshall Plan and to enact a universal military training and a selective service bill. This was one of the major steps that the U.S. took to help out anyone who hadn't turned communist. Republicans in Congress have been opposing the Marshall Plan, complaining about throwing billions of dollars into a bottomless pit of wasteful altruism. But the communist coup in Czechoslovakia has turned them around, and they approved the $5.3 billion for the plan. Continuing, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the practice by the communist side in Greece's civil war in November. The communists have been removing children from their parents and sending them to neighboring communist countries. The resolution demands return of the children, and it is shocking that communism has started such terrible things. Although we tried to stop communism from spreading to other places, Britain also began consulting quietly with various governments in Southeast Asia concerning a program of protection from the spread of communism since it was so successful in the places surrounding it. Stopping communism wasn't just something that was spoken about by authorities, but was also used through broadcasts. Frank Sinatra, for example, tried to help defeat communism in Italy by broadcasting selling the American way of life. One last huge event that happened in 1948 with communism is when Whittaker Chambers testified in front of the HUAC and named Alger Hiss, who worked on several important New Deal agencies and helped to organize the United Nations, a communist. Chambers had become a communist espionage agent, but later turned against it because of the brutality of Stalin's rule. When he testified in front of the UN, we called him out as one of his contacts in the federal government. Hiss tried to deny anything about it, but ultimately he was sent to prison for 5 years. Moving on from communism to what was going on in Korea, here is Sarah Dowd.
Thanks, Dan. Korea had a lot of action going on in 1948. Starting off in the beginning of the year, our beloved General MacArthur is reported to favor an early withdrawal of all outside military troops from Korea. In North Korea, they announced the activation and creation of its own army, whereas in South Korea, they had created their own constitution. After all this serious political talk, let's move on to some athletics and sports.
This year in sports, there were many victories and great stats for us to discuss. Starting January 8th of this year, the Winter Olympic Games, known as the V-Olympic Games, were held in St. Moritz, Switzerland. These multi-sport games were one of the first big celebrations after World War II. It was 12 years since the last Winter Games, which were going on in 1936. I have two Special Olympic bronze medalists here with us today. Frederick Fortune and Schuler Karen are here today, and they won the bronze medal in the two-man bobsledding event, and here they are now.
Thank you, Dan.
How did you guys prepare for the games?
Hours of training and practice is what got us here. I couldn't have done it without Frederick's motivation and amazing skill.
That's awesome. Well, we're all incredibly proud of you guys here at ADS News, and we wish you the best for your bobsledding careers.
Thank you so much.
Great job from our Olympians. In other sports news, the Summer Olympic Games were held in London, United Kingdom, from July 29th to August 14th. In tennis, Wimbledon banned all German and Japanese players from playing in the historic event. And finally, the Cleveland Indians won the Baseball World Series. Now we're going to switch over to Abby with a yearly recap in foreign affairs.
Thanks, Dan. 1948 was a busy year outside of the U.S., too. On May 14th, Jewish chairman David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel, establishing the first Jewish state in over 2,000 years. It was only 1 year ago that the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181 to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Over in Asia, the civil war in China rages on between the communists led by Mao Zedong and the nationalists led by Jiang Jiechi. This year, Mao's forces dominated the war. Jiang appealed for American military intervention, however. The The U.S. government had no interest in sending troops to Jiang, who was running a corrupt scheme, taking American aid and pocketing it for its own welfare. Upon his defeat, Jiang fled with remnants of nationalist government to Taiwan. Now back over to ADS Studios for our yearly roundup.
Thanks for joining us on ADS News' Yearly Report.
We hope you enjoyed it.
See you next year for 1949's report.